everybody doing? Good. It's good to be back. Happy New Year. Hope everything goes well for everybody this year. It's time to put 2020 and 2021 behind us. Hopefully we're not saying the same thing at the end of 2022. Today we are jumping into a really kind of exciting story. We're going to be talking about the Trojan War. Now, how many of you have heard of the Trojan War? Yeah. Yeah, okay. How many of you have read the Iliad? Fewer hands go up there. That's not surprising. The story of the Trojan War is really a fascinating tale. It is a story of gods and heroes and kings and warriors and jealousy and pride and hubris and all of these human emotions and all of these human complications. And it is a tale that is one of the really the oldest stories that we have in the Western literary tradition. Now, I mentioned the Iliad. Who wrote the Iliad? Homer, maybe. It's credited to a guy named Homer who may or may not have actually existed. And it's said that Homer wrote the the Iliad around the year 800 BCE. Now, the story that's told in the Iliad reflects events that occurred some 500 to 600 years earlier. Which brings us to the question, how much can we trust what we know about the Trojan War? We'll come back to this question at the end of the discussion. But the Trojan War, as I said, is one of these great tales, one of these epic tales that has, in many ways, shaped Western literature, that has given us names and heroes that we are all familiar with. So what we're going to do today is dive into that story of the Trojan War, kind of tell the tale of the literary aspect of the Trojan War, and then ask that question, well, did it really exist? Did it actually happen? So why don't we jump into it and talk about those topless towers of Ilium, gods, mortals, and the Trojan War. Now what does that title mean, the topless towers of Ilium?
All the way to heaven.
Is that familiar to anybody?
Troy.
Troy, Ilium is actually the Greek name for Troy, hence where we get the Iliad from. It's from that Greek name for Troy. But that phrase itself, the topless towers of Ilium, actually comes from an Elizabethan-era English poet, Christopher Marlowe.
Oh my goodness.
Christopher Marlowe was a contemporary of William Shakespeare's. They were friends, they were rivals, you know, that kind of a situation. He, in the late 1500s, around 1592, 1593, published a play, wrote a play called The Tragical History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus. You may know the story of Dr. Faustus, we're not going to get into it today. But in that play, he does have, Faustus does have kind of a soliloquy. He is giving a speech. In that speech, he talks about the Trojan War, or aspects of the Trojan War. He says, "Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium? Sweet Helen, make me immortal with a kiss. Her lips suck forth my soul, see where it flies. Come, Helen, come, give me my soul again. Here will I dwell, for heaven is in these lips, and all is dross that is not Helena." Christopher Marlowe was okay. Not quite Shakespeare, but he was okay. In any case, it is from this excerpt from the play that I take the title of the presentation, the talk tonight, The Topless Towers of Ilium. Now there is another aspect of the story that Marlowe mentions in this, and that is Sweet Helen. We'll get to her in a minute, however. So it is the topless towers of Ilium, the story of the Trojan War, that we are going to dive into today. Now, as with any major conflict, fictional or historical, there has to be an origin. There has to be a cause. And what is the reason why the Trojan War begins? At least according to the ancient Greek sources, the mythological sources. Well, the story of the Greek war, the Trojan War, the prologue, if you will, actually begins with a wedding. A wedding on Mount Olympus. Now, Mount Olympus was the home of the Greek gods, the Olympian gods, as they were called. And here, on Mount Olympus, we do have a wedding taking place. The wedding of Thetis and Peleus. Now Thetis was a sea nymph, she was a water goddess. And Peleus was a Greek king, a mortal, one of the early Greek heroes. These two are wed at this ceremony on Mount Olympus, and we see a 19th century, maybe 18th century depiction of the wedding right there, the gods doing things that gods do. It must be warm on Mount Olympus. But all of the gods and goddesses were invited to this wedding, except for one, the goddess of discord, named Eris. The goddess of discord was not invited to the wedding. Now, why do you think she was left off the guest list? When you're going into a wedding, you don't necessarily want discord. You want peace and happiness and good times. You don't want that contentiousness. Well, the goddess of discord, Eris, is pretty peeved that she wasn't invited to the wedding. So what does she do? Well, she lives up to her name. She goes and sows the seeds of discord. And what she does is she crafts a golden apple. And inscribed on this apple is the phrase, "To the fairest," to the most beautiful. She takes this apple and lobs it onto the table in the midst of this wedding. And all of the goddesses at the wedding, you see them all here, see this golden apple, and all of them start to claim it for themselves. Well, obviously, I'm the most beautiful. No, I'm the most beautiful. And this wedding party that was a festival, that was a good time, dissolves into discord and chaos. Eventually, three of the goddesses basically win the argument of who has the best claim to the apple. Those three goddesses who are kind of left standing at the end of the melee are Hera. Hera is the queen of the gods. She's Zeus's wife. Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And Athena, the goddess of wisdom and the goddess of war. And she is also Zeus's daughter. Famously, she springs fully formed out of Zeus's forehead. Imagine that was quite the headache. In any case, you have these three goddesses now vying for this golden apple. Each of them thinking that they are the most beautiful, that they are the most deserving of this prize. And they are arguing amongst themselves, and everybody else is kind of backing up. They want no part of this argument. And finally, the three appeal to Zeus. They say, "Zeus, you're the king of the gods. You have to make a decision. Who among us is the most fairest?" Now, in the legends of Zeus, he does a lot of shady stuff, a lot of really not smart stuff. But in this instance, we see Zeus making a wise decision. He says, "I want no part of this. I'm not going to decide. Why don't we pick somebody else?" So the gods look down from Mount Olympus, and they're looking across the Mediterranean world, and who do they see? Out in the fields, tending a flock of sheep, but a young prince from Troy, a prince named Paris. And the gods and the goddesses decide Paris needs to make this decision. Now they pick Paris because he had previously been involved in kind of a beauty contest among cattle and had made a fair decision in this beauty contest, awarding the prize to somebody else's cow rather than his own, at agrarian Greek society. So they thought he has sound judgment, he will make an unbiased decision. So the goddesses are led down to earth by the messenger of the gods, Hermes. And they approach Paris and say, "Hey, Paris, here's the thing. You need to make a decision. Who does this apple belong to?" Well, Paris, a young man, has the golden apple in his hand, sees the goddesses there before him, and he says, "I really can't make a decision. You are all so radiant, so beautiful. This is what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to go back behind the bushes over here, and you're going to have to show me your beauty." So Paris, one by one, goes behind the bushes to be convinced by the goddesses that they are the most deserving of the golden apple. So Paris has these interviews, I guess we could say, with the goddesses. And as the goddesses are there, they each try to convince Paris that they are most worthy of this prize. Hera, the queen of the gods, and also the most chaste of the goddesses, we should say, tries to bribe Paris to pick her by offering him kingship over Asia and Europe. "If you pick me, you will be the most powerful monarch on earth." Athena, the goddess of wisdom and the goddess of war, goes and promises Paris that he will be victorious in war. He will be the greatest warrior on earth. And then finally, Aphrodite, the goddess of love. When she is with Paris behind the bushes, she promises the love of the most beautiful woman on earth. Now Paris, being young and perhaps not that smart, decides to go with the most beautiful woman on earth. And he chooses Aphrodite to win the golden apple. So she is chosen the fairest of the goddesses by Paris. Now, of course, in making this decision, Paris offends Hera and Athena. They become his enemies. And that plays a role in the story later on. But Aphrodite becomes his ally. What we see here is a 19th century depiction of the judgment of Paris. Here is Paris with that golden apple, handing it to Aphrodite. You can see her charms there. While Hera, here accompanied by her peacock, and Athena, wearing her armor, are offended and stalking away. Now this scene in mythology, this idea, this moment of the judgment of Paris, is particularly popular in Western art. Really, from the Middle Ages through the Renaissance and into the Baroque and even later. Artists loved to paint this scene in different depictions. Now, why did they like to paint the judgment of Paris? Well, it gave them an opportunity to paint naked women. So historically, it is a popular theme among many Western artists. In any case, Paris makes his choice. He chooses Aphrodite to be the winner of this apple, and Aphrodite keeps up her end of the bargain. She causes the most beautiful woman on earth to fall in love with Paris. Now, who is the most beautiful woman on earth?
One of Troy.
Her name is Helen. And there we see a lovely depiction of Helen. Helen is that famous face that launched 1,000 ships that Christopher Marlowe was talking about earlier. Helen is reputed to be the most beautiful woman on earth, the most beautiful woman in at least Greece. And she becomes kind of the prize that Paris will win in making that decision. There's a problem, however. Helen is married. She's married to a man named Menelaus. Menelaus is the king of Sparta. He's the king of one of the Greek city-states. Now, it is important to remember that during this period, Greece was very much divided. It was politically fragmented, lots of independent city-states. So there were lots of kings in Greece. Some more powerful than others, some wealthier than others, but there were lots and lots of kings throughout the Greek world. So Menelaus, one of the more popular, one of the more powerful of the Greek kings, is Helen's husband. Well, what happens? Paris, a Trojan prince, is kind of making a journey through the eastern Mediterranean. He goes to Sparta to pay a visit to the polis there, the city-state. And there in Sparta, who does he meet? But Helen. And what happens? Paris falls madly in love with Helen, which is natural. She's the most beautiful woman in the world. But Helen falls madly in love with Paris. There's that deal with Aphrodite. Well, when it comes time for Paris to leave Sparta, does he leave alone? No, of course not. Helen goes with him. Now, this moment is often called the abduction of Helen. Kind of makes it seem like Paris picks her up and carries her away. But probably she went willingly. After all, here's young, handsome, virile Paris. She's married to old, grumpy Menelaus over there. She's taken off. She's walking to his boat and sailing away. And the Trojan prince and his new friend sail across the Aegean Sea off to the city of Troy. Now, it is important to remember, historically, there was a Troy. In fact, there were 9 Troys, built one on top of another. Some archaeological work there in what is today Western Turkey confirms this. Troy, at its height, was probably a pretty powerful, pretty wealthy city-state, much like the Greek city-states, and probably had contact with the Greek city-states. In all likelihood, the Trojans on the eastern side of the Aegean Sea and the Greeks on the western side of the Aegean Sea interacted frequently. For trade, they perhaps fought against each other for control of commerce and islands and that sort of thing. So we know that there was a Troy in what is today Turkey. So Paris takes off with Helen, sails back to Troy, and Menelaus, the king of Sparta, well, he's not really happy about this situation, is he? His wife has just abandoned him for this young prince. So what does Menelaus do? Well, he calls up his brother. He doesn't really call him up. He sends a messenger to his brother. His brother's name is Agamemnon. And Agamemnon is the king of another Greek city-state, the city of Mycenae, which was the most powerful and wealthiest of the Greek city-states at this time. And Menelaus says to Agamemnon, hey, we need to get Helen back. This is an assault on our honor. It's just not right. The Trojans deserve to be punished for what they had done, what they have done. So Menelaus and Agamemnon begin to call on all the other Greek kings to assemble an army, to assemble an armada, to go to Troy to take back Helen. And it is that, the abduction of Helen and the desire to get her back, that is the beginning of the Trojan War. So it is from an episode of romantic intrigue, I guess we could say, that this conflict emerges. Now, what about the war itself? How does the war go? The Trojan War, as it is recounted in these stories, was a very, very long war. It lasts for about 10 years. From the time that the Greeks first show up on the shores of Troy to the time that, well, I don't want to give away the ending, but till the time that the war ends, is about a decade. And during that time, during that decade of conflict, there are numerous heroes and kings and warriors that emerge that play a large part in moving the story forward. The story of the Trojan War, the story of the Iliad, has a vast cast of characters. On the screen you see some of the important characters, some of the major characters, the Greeks and the Trojans. Among the Greeks, you had Agamemnon, who was the king of Mycenae, who was chosen to be the leader of the Greeks going to fight at Troy. His brother, of course, Menelaus, the king of Sparta, the guy who wants to get his wife back. Odysseus, the king of Ithaca. Probably familiar with Odysseus. He has an entire epic about himself later on. He was considered the most clever, the wiliest of the Greek kings. He was the guy that could get you out of a scrape by using his brain. Let's put it that way. You had Achilles, who was a leader of a group called the Myrmidons. Achilles was reputed to be the greatest warrior in the world, undefeated in battle, described as immensely muscular and athletic and really a fantastic, heroic figure. Then there was Ajax, the prince of Salamis, who was second only to Achilles in his skill in combat. Diomedes, the king of Argos. Nestor, the king of Pylos. Nestor, by the time the Trojan War starts, was considered tremendously old, but he was very, very wise. So he's brought along because of his wisdom. The Trojans themselves had a full cast of characters that will play a part in this war, in this story. There is Priam, the king of Troy, his reckless younger son, Paris, who goes off and abducts a Greek queen. Then there's Hector, another prince of Troy, who was considered the greatest of the Trojan warriors. He plays an important role in the story of the Iliad. Hecuba, the wife of Priam, the queen of Troy. They had a daughter named Cassandra, so she was a Trojan princess. Now, Cassandra herself is a tremendously tragic figure. She was blessed by the gods with the gift of prophecy, with the gift of foresight. She could tell the future, but she was cursed in that nobody would believe what she said. So she knew the winning lottery tickets, but nobody would listen to the numbers. Let's put it that way, right? So she plays a pivotal role at the end of our story. There is Sarpadan, another Trojan warrior who was a son of Zeus, and Aeneas. Now, Aeneas' role in the story of the Trojan War is relatively minor, but his adventures really become important at the end of the saga. So I'll talk about Aeneas in a little bit more detail later on. So you have this vast cast of characters. What's also important to remember is that it wasn't only kings and heroes and warriors that were involved in the story, but it was gods and goddesses. The gods and goddesses on Mount Olympus picked sides in this struggle. Obviously, Hera and Athena supported the Greeks. Aphrodite and Ares, the god of war, supported the Trojans. And then you had people like Zeus who kind of went back and forth depending on the whims of battle and what people could convince him to do, other gods could convince him to do. So the story is tremendously complex, lots of moving parts, and lots of characters. Well, what happens? Helen is gone, she's off at Troy, she and Paris are having a grand old time over there, and the Greeks are assembling to launch an invasion of Troy, to sail across the Aegean Sea. So the Greeks gather up, and they are waiting for the wind and the tides to be right so that they could sail eastward across the Aegean Sea. But there is a problem. And the problem comes from Agamemnon, the leader of this Greek expedition. Agamemnon was a tremendously proud man, I guess we could say. And in an episode of Hubris, he goes hunting and he kills a stag, a deer, that was sacred to the goddess Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. After killing this stag, he has the gall to brag that his hunting ability is equal to that of the goddess. He's basically pissed off Artemis. And you don't really want to do that to the gods. So what happens? The Greeks assemble there, getting ready to sail. They've got their boats, they have all their equipment, they're waiting on the beach, waiting for the wind to be right, and the wind never blows. The wind never shows up. Because Artemis, in her anger at Agamemnon, has stopped the wind from blowing. So the Greeks are assembled there, waiting, and starting to grumble because nothing is happening. Eventually, a fortune teller, a prophet, comes along and says, hey, Agamemnon, you really need to make amends to the goddess. You need to make amends to Artemis so that she can make the conditions right so that you can sail. Well, how am I going to do that? What was the reply? You have to make a sacrifice. And you have to make a sacrifice that will hurt. He is told that he has to sacrifice his eldest daughter. Her name is Iphigenia. So the only way for the Greeks to be able to sail across the Aegean Sea is if Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter. Well, what does he have to do? He sends a message to Iphigenia and his wife, Clytemnestra, that they have to come right away to where the Greek fleet is assembled. And as an excuse to draw Iphigenia to the Greek fleet, she says, once you get here, I'm going to marry you off to the greatest Greek hero, to Achilles. Of course, Achilles has no knowledge of this. So Iphigenia and Clytemnestra come to where the Greeks are assembled, and what happens? Well, Iphigenia is taken, and she is offered up as a sacrifice to the gods. Here we see a dramatic scene of the sacrifice of Iphigenia. This is Artemis up here accepting this sacrifice. So once Iphigenia has been offered up to the gods, Artemis removes her ban on the Greeks. The winds start blowing, and the Greek expedition can now set sail, heading toward Troy to begin this great adventure. Now, there is something important to remember in this episode. Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, is not very happy about what happened to their daughter. Her husband basically kills the daughter and then takes off, and he's gone for 10 years. Clytemnestra has this anger stewing inside her for more than a decade. That becomes important later on in our story, so just keep that in mind as we move forward. In any case, the gods are happy, Iphigenia is dead, the Greeks get into their ships, and they sail across the Aegean Sea, those famous 1,000 ships, going to Troy to bring Helen back to her husband, to Menelaus. Now, on the other side of the Aegean Sea, at Troy, the Trojans themselves, as I said, were living quite comfortably. Troy was a prosperous, booming city. It was a thriving kingdom there in western Anatolia. These are some artistic reconstructions of what Troy may have looked like. This city itself was supposedly surrounded by stout walls, walls that had been constructed by the gods Apollo and Poseidon. So it was pretty quality workmanship there. As this image here depicts, it was a city full of life and vitality. Lots and lots of people lived in Troy. There was successful trade. It was a wealthy, prosperous place. The location of Troy was up on a ridge overlooking the Aegean Sea. So the beach was right at the foot of the city of Troy. This is important because this is where the war would take place. This is where much of the fighting would occur, on this beach outside of Troy itself. And it is here, on that beach outside of Troy, that the Greek fleet, those 1,000 ships and lots of Greek warriors, do show up. And they set about to besiege the city of Troy. Now, Troy had these stout walls. The Greeks are out there on the beach. It's pretty much a stalemate of a situation. Yet, the war does commence. The Greeks trying to punish the Trojans and take Helen back, and the Trojans trying to drive the Greeks away. And what we see is that this sandy beach over here, you can see it there in the background, will become a killing ground. It will become the place where Trojan warriors and Greek warriors are fighting against each other. Now, the images, the stories of the Trojan War do have a long legacy. And they are reflected in a lot of early Western art. The Greeks decorate a lot of their pottery with images from the Trojan War. There's a Greek killing a Trojan over there. Here we see Greeks and Trojans fighting against each other. And in later Western art, images from the Trojan War certainly are fodder for artists. They create dramatic, historical, mythological scenes. Now, the war itself, for the first 9 years, is basically this. Greek warriors and Trojan warriors fighting on the sand outside of Troy, killing one another in large numbers. The main combat, or the most important combat during the Trojan War, was often single combat. One warrior fighting against another warrior, Greek hero fighting against Trojan hero. And leading the pack, the most successful of all the warriors, the greatest figure on the battlefield, the one who was constantly undefeated, was Achilles. Achilles was a killing machine. He was a force. He would appear on the battlefield, bring fear to the Trojans, and with his mighty sword would just go chopping heads off left and right. So Achilles is really a central figure in the success of the Greek effort, and in the fighting that takes place during much of the Trojan War. Now, all of this, the first 9 years of the Trojan War, are recounted in various myths and kind of small stories throughout the Greek literary tradition. The most famous story about the Trojan War, however, is that one that is attributed to Homer, the tale that is contained in the Iliad, which you have right there. It's a light read, right? The Iliad is a story about a very small period of the Trojan War. The episode that is covered in the Iliad only covers about 50 days of the fighting during the ninth and final year of the Trojan War. So when you're reading the Iliad, there's a whole lot of backstory, stuff that happened before, and there's stuff that happens afterward. This is just one episode, one thing in this long cataclysmic struggle, this decade-long war. Now, what is the Iliad all about? Those of you who read it. What is the main focus of the story of the Iliad? It's not necessarily Helen and Paris. It's not Menelaus.
And his having, when the gods, when he was born, they held him by...
That actually happens after the Iliad.
Oh, okay.
The story of the Iliad does center on Achilles, but it is about his anger. It is about the rage of Achilles. Now, here's the opening stanza of the Iliad. This is from a 1990 translation by Robert Fagles. And I'll read this to you. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion, feasts for the dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was moving toward its end. Begin, muse, when the two first broke and clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. So it's the story about the anger of Achilles, the rage of Achilles. And what's Achilles so angry about? Well, he has a falling out with Agamemnon. What do they have a falling out about? Well, what's a common thing that guys sometimes fight over? A girl. They fight over a girl. Now, it's a little bit more complex than that. In the Greek tradition, in the classical tradition, during the Bronze Age, when warriors fought, they often took prisoners, they took hostages, they took booty. They often took women to be concubines and mistresses from the people they had conquered. And during an earlier episode of the Trojan War, the Greeks do capture some citizens of Troy, some people that are in the Trojan kingdom, and take them as hostages. Now, Agamemnon takes a young girl to be his booty, and Achilles takes another girl to be his war prize. Her name is Briseis, the one that Achilles takes. Now, the situation seems to be okay. All the Greek warriors have captured their prizes. They're taking these people back with them as trophies of war. But the problem occurs with the girl that was captured by Agamemnon. She was the daughter of a priest in the temple of Apollo. And that priest begs Agamemnon for the return of his daughter. Agamemnon ignores him, says, no, she's my prize, you can't have her back. So the priest then prays to Apollo to have his daughter returned to her. And Apollo, the god, listens to the priest from his temple, and he brings down a plague on the Greeks. And the Greeks are impacted by this plague, and they can't fight, and they don't know what's happening. Well, along comes that oracle again, that fortune teller, who says, hey, Agamemnon, you have to let the girl go. Her dad is a priest of the temple of Apollo. This plague is being brought upon us by Apollo, so she has to go back. Well, Agamemnon does agree to release the girl. She goes back to her father. The plague upon the Greeks disappears. But now Agamemnon is feeling wounded pride. He believes that his honor has been slighted because he is now the only Greek warrior without a prize. So he is determined to take a prize, and he sets his eyes upon Briseis, the girl that was taken by Achilles. Now, in the intervening time period, supposedly Briseis and Achilles fall madly in love with one another. Whether or not that's true, we don't know. But Agamemnon says, Achilles, you have to give me your prize. And Achilles says, no, that's not going to happen. And the two almost come to blows. But eventually, Achilles' mother, Thetis, the goddess, who we see here in the background, intervenes and says, you can't threaten the expedition, let the girl go. So Agamemnon ends up with Briseis, and Achilles ends up enraged, tremendously angry. So much so, in fact, that he says, well, I'm not fighting anymore. Me, my followers, were out. And he goes and sits in his tent and sulks in his tent with all of his warriors around him. Now, this is a tremendous blow for the Greeks because Agamemnon is their greatest warrior, Achilles is their greatest warrior, and without him, they can't possibly defeat the Trojans. They can fight all these battles, but the fall of Troy can't happen without the military skill of Achilles. So, it is this episode surrounding this argument between Achilles and Agamemnon that gives us the story that is in the Iliad. Basically, Achilles sulking in his tent, the Greeks trying to continue fighting against the Trojans. Now, despite the fact that Achilles is out of the fray, the fighting does continue. The fighting in this war does go on. And many of the stories in the Iliad depict single combat between Greek warriors and Trojan warriors. One of the first important battles that is fought is a fight between Menelaus, the king of Sparta, and Paris, the guy who stole his wife. You can imagine there are some passions involved in this fight. Now, the thing is, the two men face off on the battlefield. They're on the beach outside of Troy. Menelaus was the skilled warrior. He was an experienced fighter, stronger, bigger, better than Paris. Paris is depicted in the Iliad as kind of a weak figure who's not really sympathetic. He is really a problem. But in any case, here we have Menelaus facing off against Paris. Now, ideally, this fight could end the entire struggle, right? Menelaus beats up on Paris, takes his wife back, the Greeks go, the Trojan War comes to an end. The two men are facing off on the battlefield, armed to the hilt, and when they start fighting, Menelaus clearly shows his superior skill. He is hitting Paris across the head. Paris can't fight back. Paris is knocked to the ground, and Menelaus grabs him by the helmet and starts dragging him across the beach. At this point, the gods start to intervene. Aphrodite causes Paris' chin strap to snap. So the helmet comes off, and Menelaus is left holding the helmet. Paris is not killed. He gets back up onto his feet, and now Menelaus is enraged. He is tremendously angry. And depending on the account you look at, the translation you read, he picks up a giant boulder, and he's about to hurl it at Paris to smash him into little tiny bits. And just as this boulder is up above his head, we'll see it over here, Aphrodite intervenes once again. She surrounds Paris in a cloud and transports him from the battlefield up to his perfumed bedroom in the fortress of Troy. Menelaus heaves this rock, but there's no Paris. Paris has been rescued by the goddess. Again, a depiction of Paris as kind of a coward, as kind of a weakling in the story. Menelaus, of course, tremendously angry by what has happened, but this fight is largely inconclusive because Paris is gone. He is off the battlefield. So we have episodes like this. The next great battle that is depicted in the Iliad has two of the great heroes, two of the central figures of the Trojan War facing off against one another. Hector, the greatest warrior among the Trojans, and Ajax, the second greatest warrior among the Greeks. Imagine being stuck with that label, the second greatest warrior. In any case, these two men were equal in skill, equal in strength. They start fighting first thing in the morning, and their combat lasts all day. They are imbued by the gods with almost supernatural, superhuman ability. They start throwing boulders at one another, and soon the boulders are getting bigger and bigger, and they're almost the size of mountains, and they're trying to catch them. But, Hector throws a giant boulder, and Ajax catches it and throws it back, and this battle goes on all day long. And finally, as the sun is starting to descend beyond the horizon at the end of the day, the Greeks and the Trojans implore them to stop fighting. This has gone on all day. We've been watching you guys fight. It was fun at first. Now it's kind of boring. Can we just call it? And both heroes are convinced to call the day a draw. And in fact, at the end of the day, at the end of the fight, they embrace each other, they exchange gifts, and they go back to their camps. They've each fought honorably. They have fought with all their strength and beyond. Neither one was able to get the best of the other. They know that there will be fighting to take place in the future, so they call it a day, and they kind of go back. So again, another episode of the gods intervening in the fighting and the individual combat between Greek and Trojan heroes. Well, in the aftermath of this battle with Ajax, Hector and the Trojans devise a plan. The Greeks are encamped on the beach, and their boats are beached on the beach. They are, the boats have been there for years now. And the Trojans come up with a plan. They say, you know what, why don't we attack the Greek ships? The Greek ships have a wooden palisade protecting them, but they're really not that well defended. So the Trojans, led by Hector and led by Sarpadan, that other Trojan hero, decide to attack the Greek fleet. And they storm down the beach from Troy, and they overrun the Greek barricades, and they set fire to many of the Greek ships. The Greeks are now in a very dangerous position because they are just about pushed off the beach. Their ships, many of their ships are destroyed. The Greek camp itself is threatened, and the Greeks do manage to rally and kind of stop the Trojan advance, but the Trojans certainly have the advantage at this point. And it becomes apparent to everybody on the Greek side that we need Achilles. If Achilles comes back into the fray, we can turn this tide of this battle, we can push the Trojans back into Troy. But without Achilles, we are essentially sitting here hopeless. So Agamemnon sends ambassadors to visit Achilles, to try to convince him to come back into the fray. The men he sends are other kings and warriors. He sends Odysseus, again the wiliest and most clever of the Greek kings. He sends Ajax, number 2, and he sends another king named Phoenix. And they go to Achilles, here's Achilles, those are the other Greek kings, and say, you have to come back. Without you, we can't win. And Achilles says, no, unless I get an apology from Agamemnon and the girl Briseis back, I am not coming back into this fray. And in fact, I'm going to get in my boat and sail back to Greece, and maybe you guys should do the same. You're not going to win without me, and if I leave, what are you going to do? So the embassy that is sent to Achilles fails. But Achilles' friend, a guy named Petroclus, and we see Petroclus here in the background. Again, it must have been a warm day when this was painted. Has a conversation with Achilles. Now, the relationship between Achilles and Petroclus is one that is complex. In many of the Greek myths and the Greek stories, he is Achilles' companion, he is his close friend, he is his intimate confederate, he's sometimes depicted as his cousin, was probably his lover. But the two men are inseparable. Their relationship is very, very close. In fact, here we see Achilles and Petroclus, one bandaging the other. And Petroclus tries to convince Achilles, the Greeks can't win without you. You need to get back into the fray. And Achilles says, I'm not doing it. No matter what you say, I am not going to lift my sword to help Agamemnon. So then Petroclus says, you know what? How about we do this? Why don't you lend me your armor, Achilles? Achilles has this great distinctive armor. Lend me your armor, and I will go out into battle, looking like you. The Greeks will think I am you, the Trojans will think I am you, and perhaps that will be enough to rally the Greeks, to terrify the Trojans, and perhaps turn the tide of battle. So Achilles says, all right, you can borrow my armor, but be very, very careful. Just push the Trojans back from the boats. Don't attack the city of Troy itself. All you need to do is push them back. Well, Petroclus says, great, that's what I'm going to do. Sounds good. The next morning he gets up, he puts on Achilles' armor, rallies the Myrmidons behind him, rallies the Greeks, and they go and they drive the Trojans back from the Greek lines. But in the impetuousness of youth, Petroclus forgets the advice Achilles had given him, and rather than stopping, charges toward the city of Troy, heading to attack the Trojans themselves. Now, it is at this juncture that Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors, comes out onto the battlefield. And he and Patroclus engage in single combat. Now, Hector thinks he's fighting Achilles. The Trojans think Hector is fighting Achilles. The Greeks think Achilles is fighting against Hector. So we have this battle that is going on. Now, in the midst of all of this combat, the Trojan hero Sarpadan is killed. He is one of the casualties of the Greek defense of their ships. This image is a famous image from a Greek ceramic. It shows the death of Sarpadan. This is Sarpadan over here. He's the one bleeding profusely. Now, if we recall, Sarpadan was a Trojan hero, but was also the son of Zeus. And when Sarpadan dies, his father, Zeus, sends down a couple of gods to collect the mortal remains of his son. He sends down Hypnos over here and Themnos over here, the god of sleep and the god of death, to carry the body of his son up to Mount Olympus. Once the body of Sarpadan reaches Mount Olympus, the body is cleaned, his mortal remains are dissolved, and he sits by his father's side there as a god on Mount Olympus. So his story is kind of a tragic story, but it is part of the adventure of the Trojan War. So Sarpadan is dead. Hector, Patroclus, in the armor of Achilles, are now fighting outside the gates of Troy. Well, what happens? Patroclus is killed. Hector, the better warrior, kills Patroclus. Hector thinks he has killed Achilles, right? But he goes and he pulls the armor off of Patroclus and realizes that's the wrong guy. Now, he has Achilles' armor. That becomes a trophy. He goes back to Troy with the armor of Achilles, but Patroclus is now laying dead on the battlefield. When the body of Patroclus is recovered by the Greeks and brought back to the tent of Achilles, Achilles is engulfed in anguish. His dear friend, the closest person to him, is now dead because of his own unwise actions, but he is dead. And Achilles, the great Greek warrior, is now further enraged. He vows vengeance. He wants revenge on Hector. He wants to kill the man who has killed his beloved Patroclus. But Achilles has a problem. He doesn't have his armor anymore. Luckily, Achilles has connections. His mother, Thetis, a goddess. She turns to the blacksmith of the gods, named Hephaestus, and has Hephaestus create a new set of armor, a glowing, sparkling, dynamic set of armor for Achilles. And she brings that new armor, you see it over here, to Achilles so that he can go and avenge his friend. Now, while she brings the armor to her son, she also brings a warning. She says, the fates have decreed that you can live a long, happy life of obscurity, or a short, tragic life of glory. If you rush into battle, your name will become immortal, but you will die young. If you stay in your tent, if you sail back to Greece, you will live a long, prosperous, happy life, but nobody will remember you. It's a stark choice to make, isn't it? Well, Achilles being a warrior, dons this new armor and sets out to avenge the death of his friend Petroclus. He goes back out onto the battlefield. The Greeks are in awe. The Trojans are in terror. By all accounts, Achilles basically is just massacring people left and right. Any Trojan he sees, he is lopping their heads off. He is clearing the battlefield looking for Hector. And eventually Hector is compelled to come out of Troy to face Achilles on the battlefield. And what we see in this single combat between Achilles and Hector is really one of the high points of the Iliad, one of the high points of the Trojan War itself. The two great heroes stand face to face outside the gates of Troy, while the population of Troy is watching from the battlements. The Greeks are watching from further down the beach. These two men engage in combat. It doesn't go so well for Hector. The rage of Achilles, the anger of Achilles, overwhelms the Trojan prince, and Hector is brutally killed in front of his family, in front of his countrymen, there at the gates of Troy. At the moment, or just before Hector is killed, he begs Achilles, don't desecrate my body. You can kill me, but allow for my body to be buried properly so that my soul can go to Elysium, go to the afterlife. Achilles has none of that. He is so enraged and so full of vengeance that after he kills Hector, rather than leaving his body on the battlefield, he takes him and ties him to the back of his chariot and rides around the walls of Troy, dragging the body of Hector behind him. Now, luckily for Hector's sake, or for his body's sake, I guess, Aphrodite has taken pity on him and has protected his body. So though he's being dragged over rocks and sand, his body is not damaged. But Achilles will not allow for proper funeral ceremonies to be held for Hector. In fact, he takes the body back to the Greek camp and kind of holds it as a trophy in his tent. So there is tremendous vengeance rolled up in Achilles. He kills Hector, but he doesn't stop. He is now fully engaged, fully in bloodlust, and is just slaughtering Trojans left and right. In fact, at one point in the story of the Trojan War, the river god, Scamander, gets angry at Achilles because Achilles is killing so many bodies and pushing them into the river that it's blocking the flow of the river. So Achilles ends up fighting against the river god until Zeus intervenes. So he is just really full of bloodlust at this point in the story. Now, the death of Hector is really kind of a tragic moment in the story of the Iliad, in the story of the Trojan War itself. Because Priam, the king of Troy, is heartbroken that his son is dead and heartbroken that he cannot perform proper funeral rituals for his son. He wants to get Hector's body back. So he prays to the gods. And the god Hermes, the messenger of the gods, transforms, disguises Priam. It allows Priam to cross the Greek lines and go to Achilles' tent. There in Achilles' tent, Priam reveals himself as the king of Troy, and he falls down on his knees and begs Achilles for the return of Hector's body. Achilles takes pity on the old man, on the king, and agrees to allow for the proper burial of Hector, turns the body back over to the king, and Hector's body is returned to Troy. We see two depictions of that scene. This is a Greek one over here with Hector begging Achilles for the body of his son. Now this episode, where Priam is begging for the return of Hector's body, is really the end of the Iliad. This is the last scene in that epic poem that is credited to Homer. But it is certainly not the end of the story of the Trojan War, because combat continues after the death of Hector. And that combat, much of the fighting, again, centers around Achilles. Though he has a moment of mercy here, he is still enraged, he is still full of that anger and that bloodlust, and he is still killing Trojans by the score. The Trojans themselves do have a couple of allies that come to help them fight against the Greeks. There are kings from other parts of the world that come to assist the Trojans. One of them is a guy named Memnon, who is the king of Ethiopia. He brings his troops to help drive the Greeks away from Troy. Well, things don't go well for Memnon because he ends up crossing Achilles, and what happens to Memnon? He is killed by Achilles. Another group that comes to help the Trojans are the Amazons. Now, who are the Amazons? They'll bring you your packages in 24 hours. They are a group of, that's a good, right? They are a group of women warriors, reputedly from kind of the Ural Mountains, the southwest Russia, that sort of area, the Ukraine, a mythical group of women warriors. They come to the assistance of Troy. They are led by their queen Penthesilea. And again, Achilles, you know, he's having a bad day again. And he goes out on the battlefield and he is killing Amazons left and right. And he ends up in single combat with Penthesilea, the queen of the Amazons. You think Achilles could have afforded a pair of pants here, but he's busy, he's out there killing people. In this combat, Achilles does get the upper hand. And just as he is plunging his sword into the chest of Penthesilea, he gazes upon her and is bewitched by her beauty and falls madly in love with her. But he has just killed her. Part of the tragedy of Achilles, I guess. So he is really dominating the fighting at this point. The Trojan efforts are faltering because their greatest heroes are dead, and Achilles is really, really angry. Well, what happens? The Greeks are ransacking parts of the Anatolian countryside, the countryside around Troy. They are putting tremendous pressure on the city of Troy itself, and they have Achilles on their side. The Greeks seem, victory for the Greeks seems almost inevitable. But something happens. Something happens to Achilles. Now, what do we know about Achilles? His backstory. He is invulnerable, except for his heel. Now, what happens? Why does that happen? His mother, Thetis, when Achilles was a baby, according to one version of the story, takes him to the river Styx, the river at the entrance to Hades, to the underworld, and dips him into the river Styx to grant him this immortality, this imperviousness. But in dipping him, she is holding on to his ankle. The only part of him that doesn't go underwater is that ankle, making the only vulnerable spot on Achilles his ankle. He is the greatest warrior. Of course, knowing that you can't be killed or hurt probably increases your chances of success on the battlefield, but he only has one vulnerable spot, and that is that ankle. And it is that ankle that will be his downfall. It will be his Achilles heel. And what happens is that the Greeks, again, rampaging, really putting tremendous pressure on the Trojans. And there are different accounts of the death of Achilles, none of them included in the Iliad. They come from other sources later on and earlier on. But the common story is that the Greeks are having success on the battlefield. And Paris, the prince of Troy, the cowardly prince of Troy, at one time is hiding in the bushes. And he sees Achilles walk by, and he takes an arrow from his quiver and launches the arrow at Achilles. The god Apollo intervenes and directs that arrow to strike Achilles in his only vulnerable spot, his heel. What we see depicted here is Achilles and Paris hiding behind a statue, Apollo guiding the arrow that ends up going through Achilles' heel. This wound proves to be mortal. Achilles dies because of the arrow shot by Paris. Achilles does have, the Greeks do recover Achilles' body, they do have a proper funeral ceremony for him, and supposedly his ashes are interred with those of Petroclus. The two men remain together eternally from that moment forth. But the great Greek hero, fulfilling the prophecy that his mother saw, his name becomes immortal, but his life tragically short because of that one weakness, because of that Achilles heel. Achilles is dead, but the war continues on. The Greeks and the Trojans still engaged in combat. Eventually, however, the Greeks do devise a plan of how to defeat the Trojans. They come up with this fantastical idea, an idea that is credited to Odysseus, the wiliest, the sneakiest, the most clever of the Greek kings. And what's Odysseus's big idea? Let's build a horse. Let's build a giant wooden horse. We'll tear down some of our boats to find the lumber to create this horse. We will then leave this horse outside the gates of Troy. We'll get on our boats and we will sail away. Seems simple enough, right? But what's the catch? The horse is hollow, and Greek warriors are hiding out inside of it. The idea was that the Trojans would be so happy that the Greeks were gone, and they would see this giant wooden horse and think, it's a trophy. The Greeks have left. They are leaving this, this gift for us at the end of these 10 years of combat. So the Greeks set about to build this giant wooden horse following the plans of Odysseus. Greek warriors are hidden inside it. The rest of the Greeks get into their ships and they apparently sail away. They basically just sail around the peninsula that Troy was located on. The Trojans themselves, looking down from the walls of Troy, see that the Greeks are no longer there, see this wooden horse, and they wonder what to do. They go out and they inspect the horse. The Greek Priam, the king of Troy, says, what should we do with this horse? And some of the Trojans are saying, well, let's bring it into the city. It's obviously a trophy we should celebrate. Cassandra, the daughter who is blessed with foresight but cursed that nobody believes her, says, that's a bad idea. I don't think we should bring this horse into the city. Let's burn it on the beach. And everybody says, you don't know what you're talking about. Stop talking. And the horse is wheeled into the city, and Troy breaks out into a festival like has never been seen. There is round-the-clock celebration, feasting and drinking, and everybody's having a really good time because they think the Greeks are gone. They think this decade-long war has finally come to an end. Well, what happens? The Trojans party too hard, I guess we could say, and sooner or later, everybody goes to bed or passes out in the street or whatever, and when the city falls silent, those Greek warriors hidden inside the horse sneak out of the horse, go to the main gates of Troy, and fling the gates open. For the Greeks that had returned under cover of darkness to the beach outside of Troy, the Greeks then swarm into the city of Troy, massacring everybody, setting the city on fire, taking prisoners. Cassandra is taken prisoner by the Greek king Agamemnon. Other Trojans are taken prisoner by other Greek warriors and Greek kings. The city of Troy itself destroyed by the Greeks. Very few survivors from Troy exist at the end of this event. There are those hostages that are taken, and there are a handful of people that manage to escape the destruction of the city. Troy, that had once been a great city, a powerful kingdom in its own right, one of the rivals to the Greeks, ceases to exist. The Trojan War comes to an end with the Greek victory through trickery. But is that the end of the story? No, because as with any good story, there is an epilogue. There is an afterword. What happens after the fall of Troy?
10 years, another 10 years.
Well, for one person, there's another 10 years. The Greeks, now loaded down with booty and treasure and hostages and victory, all begin the long journey home. Not really that long of a journey, but they begin the journey home. And many of the Greek kings begin to return to their kingdoms. Agamemnon goes home to Mycenae. Menelaus has recaptured Helen and takes her back to Sparta with him. All the other Greek kings that are still alive, the Greek heroes that are still alive, return to Greece to bask in the glory of this victory, to celebrate the fact that they have defeated this great rival. And things work out great for all of them, right? No, not at all, in fact. We can look at the story of Agamemnon to kind of see how things went bad. Now, remember Agamemnon, the leader of the Greeks, had to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia at the start of this conflict, 10 years before. Well, when he comes home, 10 years after, his wife is still quite angry at him. She's a little bit perturbed, I guess we could say. And she herself has taken up with a young man named Aegisthus. Aegisthus and Clytemnestra are lovers, and all of a sudden here comes Agamemnon, who has murdered Iphigenia, been away for 10 years, and to make matters worse, Agamemnon shows up with a young girl by his side, Cassandra. So there is tremendous anger, there is tremendous jealousy in Clytemnestra, and she is convinced, or she is persuaded by Aegisthus that they have to do away with Agamemnon. So what happens? Agamemnon is murdered by his wife. Some accounts say he's murdered in his bed, like what's about to happen right here. Some say he's murdered in his bath. Sometimes it's Clytemnestra herself who stabs him. Sometimes it's both her and Aegisthus who are plunging the swords into his chest. In any case, Agamemnon, his victory in the Trojan War is short-lived. He meets his demise because he is murdered by his wife. There might be some sort of life lesson there, but we won't get into it. Another one of the kings who sets off, loaded down with booty and hostages and glowing in victory, is Odysseus, the king of Ithaca. Odysseus should have a relatively easy journey to get back to Greece, right? Leaving Troy, sailing westward across the Aegean Sea, doesn't take that long. But what happens to Odysseus? He kind of gets lost, but he gets lost because he has offended the god Poseidon. And Poseidon decides to make it difficult for Odysseus to get home. And what should have been a relatively easy journey ends up being a 10-year odyssey. As Odysseus is thrown about the Mediterranean, facing all sorts of dangers and troubles. He is seduced at one point by the Sirens. He is held hostage by the witch Circe, who turns his men into swine, into pigs. He has to escape the clutches of the Cyclops Polyphemus. He manages to navigate between the Scylla and the Charybdis, the cliff and the whirlpool that was known to destroy ships. He undergoes all of these adventures and all of these trials, eventually does make his way back home to Ithaca, 20 years after he departed. In all of that time, his wife has remained loyal to him. Though the palace is full of suitors, of men who want to marry his wife, her name is Penelope, who want to assume the kingship of Ithaca, she has managed to resist all of their advances. His son, who was a child when he left, is now a grown man. His name is Telemachus. And by the time Odysseus arrives in Ithaca, he is in tatters, he is unbathed, his clothes are essentially gone. He looks like a vagrant. He is washed up on the shore of Ithaca, totally unrecognizable, except to one person, one being, his dog. He is recognized by his loyal dog who has waited for his master's return. The dog comes up to Odysseus, sniffs his hand, wags his tail, and drops dead. But Odysseus does go to his palace. He does reveal himself to Telemachus. He does reveal himself to his wife, and he manages to chase all of those suitors out of the palace and reassume his throne as the king of Ithaca. And finally, the last afterwards story that I want to tell is of a Trojan who survived the sack of Troy. A Trojan prince by the name of Aeneas. As I mentioned at the beginning, Aeneas is a relatively minor character in the story of the Trojan War, depending on which account you look at. He was a nephew of Priam, one of these princes of Troy. The reason why Aeneas is important is because as Troy is being sacked, as the Greeks are rampaging through the city, Aeneas manages to escape with his wife, his child, and his aged father. His name is Anchises, who Aeneas carries out on his shoulders. Aeneas and his family get into a boat and they sail away from Troy. And they themselves end up on an odyssey across the Mediterranean, their own 10-year journey that eventually lands them on the western shore of Italy near the mouth of the Tiber River. Now, why is that significant? Because Aeneas will eventually establish a city, will eventually establish an outpost there, and will establish a kingdom, and his descendants, a pair of twin brothers named Romulus and Remus, will later go on to establish a city on 7 hills in the vicinity of the Tiber River, a city that will become Rome. The Romans trace their origins to Aeneas, the hero who escaped the Trojan War, the destruction of Troy. So the Romans create their own backstory, their own mythology, tied into this epic tale from the Greek world. Now, what does that tell us about the Romans? One is that they liked the Greek stories a lot. In fact, what did they do with the Greek gods? They just renamed them all and take them to Rome. And they build a lot of their mythology, a lot of their origin stories on tales that the Greeks had told. It is with Aeneas that the story of the Trojan War really does come to an end. And it is at this point where we can ask that question. Did the Trojan War happen?
In somebody's mind.
Well, they found Troy.
They did find Troy. As I said, there were 9 cities of Troy stacked one on top of each other. I think it's Troy 5 or Troy 6 that is from the time period when the Trojan War was supposedly fought. But there is no archaeological evidence. There is no textual evidence other than these mythological stories that a massive war, a 10-year conflict between the Greeks and the Trojans took place. Now, was there likely conflict between the Greeks and the Trojans? Certainly. Again, they were rivals. They were competing for the same resources, for the same regional influence. I'm sure that Greek city-states fought against representatives of the Trojans, and the Trojans fought on some of the Greek islands. There probably was some of that went on. But the story, as it comes down to us, as related in the myths, as related in the Iliad, is just that, a story. There might be a kernel of truth in there somewhere, but it is mainly a folk tale that has been told to us. If you look around, the gods tend to not intervene so much in our daily lives anymore, right? Maybe none of us are sufficiently heroic. But that is the end of the story of the Trojan War. Now, does anybody have any questions? Yes?
How many years did it take you to learn the names of all the people?
Wow, yeah, your memory is impressive.
10 years.
It took a while. I'm on the return journey now, so I should be done in about 9.5 years.
Tremendous.
Any other questions?
No, but I think
Who
Marlowe,
might know if it was real? That's Brad Pitt.
Brad Pitt. Now, that brings us to Hollywood and Hollywood interpretations of the story of the Trojan War. As I said at the beginning, this tale is tremendous fodder for the Western literary tradition and also for Western cinema. There have been countless tales told of Troy, of the Trojan War, of the heroes of the Trojan War, and lots of movies made of the story of the Trojan War. The most recent one that I can think of, the most recent big budget story of the Trojan War was the movie called Troy that starred Brad Pitt as Achilles. Entertaining movie to watch. I'm not a movie critic, so I won't get into it beyond that, but certainly does add some dynamism to the story as it has come down to us. Now, one of the things to remember is that the story of the Trojan War has many different versions. You know, there were earlier Greek stories about the Trojan War that have kind of a different origin, that have different figures that are involved in some of the conflict. The tale of the Death of Achilles has different interpretations and different versions. There's one version where he's climbing the walls of Troy and is shot by a poison arrow that hits him in the heel. You know, that sort of thing. So because it is such a long story, such a complex story, and such an old story, there are lots of different aspects of the tale that have been told, that have been retold, that have been transformed over the 3,000, 4,000 years that the story has existed. So Hollywood interpretations might not be true to the Iliad, but they are certainly interpretations of the tale itself. Yes?
I was gonna say, I enjoyed your pictures.
Thank you.
and all that.
Yes.
Some of the painters have.
Again, the legacy on Western art makes this a really easy to do some visually stunning images, because there are so many images of the story of the Trojan War.
Is it one artist? They seem to have similar colors. Are they one particular artist?
They're different artists that I chose from. I think I picked colors that were vibrant and that looked good on the screen. There are some that are much more muted. There's a lot of ancient Greek images, of course the Roman images. So there's an entire school of study just on images and art of the Trojan War. I'm sure somebody's written a dissertation on that. So, so any other questions?
I'm trying to remember, was the marathon story part of the Trojan War?
No, that is part of the Persian Wars.
Persian.
The Persian Wars historically happened. We have good resources and sources for that. The story of Marathon is the Persians, the first Persian invasion in 490 BC. The Persians invade, they launch an invasion of Greece. The Athenians can't get any allies, so they have to face the Persians on their own, and the Persians land at this place called Marathon, and the Athenians manage to chase the Persians all away from Marathon. And then Phidippides runs from Marathon to Athens to announce that the Athenians have won, and then famously drops dead. He runs that 26 miles and collapses. Now, the story of Phidippides is a little bit longer than that, but that's what he's doing.
Boston Marathon. Oh, my goodness.
But Marlowe had a different idea from the painter. The towers had towers, it was not topless.
These are certainly not topless. These do have a top. I think what Marlowe was getting at was that they were imposing, right? He was using the colorful language of Victorian England to give us a sense of the grandness of Troy itself. Okay, last one, I think.
And what was the years, the 10-year period that supposedly?
The Trojan War probably took place in the 13th century BCE. So, somewhere in there.
Was Helen so beautiful after 10 years?
You know, that is a wonderful question. We could probably do a before and after kind of art exhibit. Helen before and Helen after, you know? So, anyway, it was good to see you all. Thanks a lot. And I will